This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video, I'd like to provide a guide for students who are working through Aesop's Fables in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I'd like to study Fable number 21, titled The Wind and the Sun, Aesop's Fable of the Wind and the Sun. As we always do, we'll read through the fable together, then we'll make sure we understand and have in mind all of the details of the fable. Then we'll seek to identify one or more moral lessons in the fable, and lastly, we'll consider how we might apply this fable in our own individual lives. So let's begin by simply reading through the fable from beginning to end, and then we'll go back through it, make sure all the details are clear and everything is understood, and then we'll talk about the moral lesson of this fable. So let's read the fable of the wind and the sun. A dispute once arose between the north wind and the sun as to which was the stronger of the two. Seeing a traveler on his way, they agreed to try which could the sooner get his cloak off him. The north wind began and sent a furious blast, which, at the onset, nearly tore the cloak from its fastenings. But the traveler, seizing the garment with a firm grip, held it round his body so tightly that Boreas, which is the name of the north wind, Boreas spent his remaining force in vain. The sun, dispelling the clouds that had gathered, then darted his most sultry beams on the traveler's head. Growing faint with the heat, the man flung off his cloak and ran for protection to the nearest shade. This is the fable of the wind and the sun. Now, as I always explain, we've got to make sure we understand and are aware of all of the details of the fable, because the meaning of the fable often depends, almost always depends, on all of the details. So let's be careful. Sometimes students will read the fables and they'll get a certain idea of what the fable means, but they're not thinking about all the details in the fable, and some of the details make their understanding of it impossible. And so we've got to make sure we see all of the details before we try to figure out the meaning of the fable. So we read here that a dispute once arose. A dispute is a disagreement or a fight. A disagreement arose between the north wind and the sun. So notice the title here is really not very accurate. We don't simply have a dispute between the wind and the sun. We have a dispute between the north wind and the sun, and that's actually very important. The north wind is wind that comes from the north. So when we say north wind, the name that's given to the wind refers to the direction from which the wind is coming. So it doesn't mean wind that's blowing towards the north. It means wind that's coming from the north. And the reason why the source of the wind is important is because the north is associated with cold, and the south is associated with hot, at least where we live, because on the earth we live in the northern hemisphere, where the northern tip is cold, the North Pole, and the southernmost part, the equator, is hot. So the north wind, wind coming from the north, is normally cold wind. So we could think of this as a dispute once arose between the cold wind and the sun. And you can immediately start to see that that reveals what the dispute is. A dispute once arose between the cold wind and the warm sun. The dispute was that they had a contest. They had an argument about which of them was stronger. Which of them is stronger, the north wind, the cold wind, or the sun? Which was stronger? Seeing a traveler, that is a man, seeing a traveler on his way, a man walking or maybe riding on a horse along the way, they agreed to have a contest to try which could sooner get his cloak off him. A cloak is like a jacket. So this man was traveling and he was wearing a cloak, which is meant for what purpose? To keep him warm, to keep him dry, and so on. So they had a contest to see which of the two could succeed in getting his cloak off him. Since their argument was about who is the stronger, well, let's have a contest. Let's see who's stronger. Hey, look, there's a guy with a coat on. Let's see who can get his coat off him. And so the north wind went first. And we read, the north wind began and sent a furious blast. So blasted him with cold air. At the onset, that means at the beginning, the blast of the air nearly tore the cloak from its fastenings, almost ripped the cloak off him. But notice it doesn't say it took it off him. It says it nearly tore it from him. But the traveler, feeling the wind blowing his cloak, seized the garment, grabbed hold of the garment with a firm grip, and held it round his body so tightly that Boreas, which is the name for the north wind, spent his remaining force in vain. So notice what happened. The north wind tried to blow the cloak off the man. But the man's response to that wind was to actually grab onto the cloak and hold it on himself more tightly. So the outcome was actually worse than the original situation. In the beginning, the man was traveling, thinking about his travel, and just wearing his cloak. At the end, he is now holding tightly onto his cloak and holding it around his body so that there was nothing that the wind could do. So the wind tried and failed. And so it was the sun's turn. And so the sun, the first thing he did was he dispelled the clouds. He drove away all the clouds that had gathered from that north wind. He drove all the clouds away so the sky was nice and clear. And then he darted. He targeted the beams of the sun like arrows. His most sultry beams, the hottest beams that he had, he targeted them at the traveler's head. So he sends down this laser beam of sunlight right onto the traveler's head. That heat from the sun caused the traveler to grow faint. That means it made him lightheaded and weak. Growing faint with the heat, the man flung off his cloak and ran for protection to the nearest shade. This is the fable again of the wind and the sun. So let's consider what happened here. and what the moral lesson might be. Let's think about this carefully. Let's meditate on this fable. First of all, we have these two characters, the north wind, the cold wind, as I said, and the warm sun. So we've got these two characters that represent cold and warmth. And they have an argument about who's stronger. And so they agree to have a contest. And let's consider this contest. They would have a contest to see who could get the cloak off the man. And we should ask ourselves, is this a reasonable contest to see who's the stronger here? Is this a reasonable contest? If we think about the cloak, what is the purpose of the cloak? As I said, the cloak is used to keep a man warm. So if we had a contest and we said, well, the contest is going to be to see who can get the cloak off this man. And the cloak is meant to keep the man warm. It would seem that it wouldn't make much sense for a cold wind to try to make him colder. If the cloak is for the purpose of keeping warm, making him colder, making him more cold, would cause him to want to hold the cloak even tighter. He'd even want another cloak if he could find one, or a blanket. So it's not a very good idea for the north wind to get into a contest where the contest would test whether he could get someone to take off his coat. That doesn't make much sense. Whereas the sun, if this was the contest, well, this is easy because the purpose of that cloak is to protect a man from the cold. And when it's warm, men don't wear cloaks. So the sun clearly had an advantage in this contest. And it doesn't seem that the north wind realized that. This was not a good contest, not a good test of who was stronger. But the north wind accepted the contest and tried to prove that he could do whatever he wanted and was stronger than the sun. And as we saw, when the north wind began to blow, the cold, strong wind, the man grabbed onto the cloak and held it even tighter, meaning that the north wind was actually fighting against nature. And when the north wind fought against nature and tried to do something that really didn't make any sense, the man resisted the north wind, and the north wind failed, spent his remaining force in vain. The north wind was trying to work against nature, so he was at a disadvantage, and he failed. But then the sun went, and the sun said, "This is easy." So he drove the clouds out of the way, and then notice the sun doesn't do anything to the cloak at all. The north wind tried to blast the cloak off the man. The sun doesn't even touch the cloak. It says that he darted his most sultry beams on the traveler's head. Didn't even give any attention to the cloak, but targeted his attack at the traveler's head. Made him hot, made him weary, caused him to feel as if he was going to faint. And then we read that the man freely and voluntarily flung off his cloak. So did the opposite, whereas he gripped his cloak and held it tightly. Now he does the opposite. He actually grabs hold of his cloak and throws it off and ran for protection from that heat to the nearest shade. And so when we look at this fable, most people, I think, would read this and they would say, oh, I see what happened here. The north wind tries to be violent. He tries to be rough and tries to force someone to do something. But the sun doesn't try to do that. The sun doesn't try to force someone to do that. The sun is just gentle, and the man takes his jacket off because the sun tries to move him gently. So, the moral of the lesson is that we should try to lead people with gentleness rather than by being rough with them. And that would be a good explanation of the moral, but it doesn't include all of the details that are in the fable. It doesn't include the details. That, again, that would make sense if this was, in fact, the fable of the wind and the sun, and all we knew was that the wind tried to blast the man with wind, with air, and the man resisted it and held on to his jacket just because he didn't want it to blow off. But that's really not what the fable teaches. The fable has more detail. It says it's a cold wind. And so for cold wind to try to blow off a man's cloak is for cold air to work contrary to nature. And for the sun to try to take a man's cloak off, that's to actually work according to nature. And so it's no surprise that the sun has an easier task. And this does not prove that the sun is stronger than the wind. In fact, it proves that strength really isn't that important, because as strong as the north wind might be, it's going to fail to cause a man or to cause an outcome that's contrary to nature. And the sun can actually be less strong, but because he's working with nature, he can be successful. So there's more to this fable than just a story of the vanity of trying to force people to do things. That's really not the message. It has to do with the nature of this challenge and what the wind and the sun are trying to do. And what I would say the moral of this lesson is that it's always wise to act according to nature. It's always wise to work with nature, to work in harmony with nature, rather than against nature. It's always best to work with nature, and it's always wise to avoid trying to work against nature. And I'll give an example. So let's think of an application here. Many people talk about buying dogs, and when they think about buying a dog, they look through pictures or through maybe a magazine or something that shows all different kinds of dog breeds, and they look at all the dogs and they say, oh, this one's cute. Oh, I like this fluffy one. Oh, this one's cool. He's big and fast. And this one, oh, she's so cute, this little puppy. And people think about getting a dog that they like based on the way it looks or the way that it feels or how big or small it is. And they think that you can choose a dog based on how it looks, that you can just pick whatever style dog you like, just like picking different color shirts. But then we bring the dog home. Now, we did this one time. We bought a certain breed of dog. We bought an English Shepherd. Beautiful dog. We saw pictures of the English Shepherd and we said, oh, that's the most beautiful dog we've ever seen. And we found a breeder who was breeding English Shepherds, and we decided that we wanted to go and get an English Shepherd. It was when my wife and I were young, and we just had a couple of young children, and we wanted to get a dog for the family. So we drove out to the mountains and we bought the most beautiful English Shepherd puppy and brought him home. Because he was an English Shepherd, we named him Beckett. If you're an older Catholic, you'll understand that name. We named him Beckett, and we had this beautiful English Shepherd puppy in the house. And for a while, we kept him in the house as a puppy, and we trained him in his crate in the house, made sure he was taken out to go to the bathroom, and we house trained him, and that went very well. So we were happy about that. But then Beckett started to grow and get bigger, and we used to take him outside, and he loved to run around. He loved to run and climb and jump all over the place. And we had a little backyard area fenced in, even though we lived on a farm. We had a little backyard area that was fenced in. And as Beckett started to grow up, he started to get out of the fenced area. And we didn't know how he was getting out because he was a little thing. And we had a 4-foot high fence, and yet we would look outside and see Beckett running around the farm. He would always get out of this backyard fence. And so I added more fencing to the fence. I put up wire mesh inside the fence. I made sure all the gates were locked and closed. I made sure there were no gaps anywhere. And after doing all this work to make the fence more secure and make sure everything was tight so Beckett couldn't get out, the next thing I know, I see Beckett running through the field. He had gotten out of the backyard fence again. And I thought to myself, how in the world is this dog getting out? There must still be some weak spot in the fence where he's getting out or he's getting under the fence in some way. And I looked around and I couldn't find anything. And so finally, one day, I happened to look out into the backyard when Beckett was out back, and I noticed him climbing up the fence. He was climbing the fence like a kid, climbing hand and foot up the fence. And he climbed up the fence, got to the top of the fence, and jumped off, and then ran across the field. So I saw that he was actually climbing over the fence. He was much too small to jump over the fence, but he was actually climbing over the fence like a person would climb a fence. And so I said, man, there's no way to keep this dog in that fence. He can just climb right over it. So we went to the store, the farm supply store, and we bought a kennel for Beckett that was 6 feet tall, a high kennel, 6 feet tall. And I even put fencing on top of the kennel because I knew that he could climb. So I put fencing across the top of the kennel and wired it all together tight. And I said, there, now Beckett won't be able to climb over the fence. I know he'll be safe when we put him outside. We can put him in the kennel and he'll be nice and safe and we don't have to worry about him. Well, that worked for a few days. And then one day, I saw out in the back field Beckett running through the field. And I couldn't figure out how he could possibly have gotten out. And so I went out to the kennel to see what happened, and I found a giant hole in the kennel, right in the side of the fencing. And what Beckett had done with his teeth was actually pull the fencing apart on one side of the kennel. He actually pulled the fencing apart and made an opening big enough that he could slip through. And so he was able to still find a way to get out of that kennel and get out into the field where he could run around. And I couldn't believe it because it was a strong chain link fence. But he was able to pull it apart and get out of it. So I sat down next to the kennel, fixed the fence, tied it all back together, and I added more wiring to it to make it stronger. Fence wire, heavy steel, strong fence wire. And I wired it up and tied it all together. A couple days later, he got out again, and he got out again. And finally, we started to joke around in our family and say we should have named Beckett Spirit because there's no way to keep him inside of a fence. And finally, I just gave up and said, you know what? There's no way we're ever going to keep him inside of a fence because he's a shepherd dog. And these shepherd dogs, if you learn about shepherd dogs, they live on farms where there are hundreds and hundreds of acres, and they run and they run and they run, and they're used to herd sheep. That's why they're called shepherds. They're used to run far and wide around the sheep herds and help the shepherd to bring all the sheep back to the fold. They're used to actually direct and lead the sheep where they need to go. They're used like a fence. They almost are a living fence for sheep. But they love to climb and run and jump, and they're very smart, and they belong in the field. A shepherd dog, by its nature, belongs out in a big open field. That's what the shepherd dog is made for. And if you try to put the shepherd dog in a little backyard or in a little kennel, that dog is going to get out of that fence, because that fence is trying to keep that dog contrary to nature. And that's what I was doing. I was trying to control that dog contrary to nature, and it didn't work. So what we finally did, as I said, was we just let the dog out. And we found that dog loved us, and the dog would run through the fields and run all over the farm and come and sit in the backyard freely, because it wanted to be by us. But it wanted to run, because that was its nature, to run and control any animals that were out in the field. It wanted to run and be a shepherd dog. And so when we had that experience, we said, you can't just pick a dog based on what you like or how it looks. You've got to really be careful to think about a dog breed and understand the nature of that dog breed, because if you try to make that dog live contrary to its nature, you'll probably fail and be very unhappy with that dog. So that was an example in my life where I tried to force that dog to stay in a little backyard area. And what I was trying to do was contrary to nature. And when I let that dog out and actually let him run around, there was no problem at all. And I was able to manage that dog very happily by simply working with nature rather than working against nature. And I would say that that's what we see here in this fable of the north wind and the sun. The sun is wiser than the north wind because he works according to nature. The north wind is foolish because he tries to work contrary to nature. And no matter how strong we are, no matter how strong we may be, we will never succeed if we try to work against nature. Now, the reason why this is so important is because in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we study natural philosophy. Now, when I say we need to always make sure that we're working with nature and not working against nature, we have to learn what it means to work with nature. We have to learn how nature works, or else we can't even know if we're working with nature or against nature. So you can see it's very important for us to learn how nature works. And this is the purpose of natural philosophy. In natural philosophy, we study the natural world because we believe that when God created the world, he created everything with a purpose. He created everything to work in a certain way. Every different animal, every different plant, every different substance has a purpose. And when we study natural philosophy, we seek to learn what God's purpose is in everything. Because as human beings, the job that God gave us was not to do whatever we want in the natural world. He didn't create all the animals and plants and say, do whatever you want with them. No, they already had a nature built into them by God. What God did was gave man reason to allow him to learn the nature of everything that God created, and then the ability, because of that reason, to manage and order everything and keep everything in order according to its nature. And that's what it means to live and act wisely. To live and act wisely means to live according to nature. And everything that you possess, you manage according to nature. That's wisdom, practical wisdom. And so in natural philosophy, we seek to study and learn the order that exists in the natural world. And here in this fable, we can see how our success in studying natural philosophy can help us in moral philosophy when we have decisions to make. Because we can think, what should I do in this situation? And before we answer that question, we should think, what does nature suggest that I should do in this situation? How does my understanding of the nature of things direct me in deciding what the right thing to do would be? What would be morally right? So we can see in this fable how a knowledge of natural philosophy and moral philosophy work together. You can't have one without the other. And so, in studying true philosophy in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, this is what we seek to understand. So, we can think of many, many examples of how we need to make sure that we work with nature rather than against nature. Another good example would be in parenting. When a man is responsible to raise a child, often people think that, well, the way you can raise a good child is by being very, very strict. And they think that they can be very strict with a child, just like I tried to keep Beckett in a cage in the backyard. They think that's the way that you raise a child, is by being very, very strict. But the nature of a human being is to be free. And so we have a problem when a parent tries to be very, very strict and use strictness and force to raise a human being whom God gave free will. And so we can see how that leads to trouble. God gave to the child reason and free will. And when parents think to be very strict, to try to control children by force, they end up spending all of their time fighting with the children. And they say, oh, this child is so bad. I tell him what to do, and I make the rules, and I'm strict, and he constantly disobeys. But what they don't think is whether what they're doing makes sense in light of human nature. And so we learn from this fable also the importance of trying to influence other people by thinking about human nature. And this, again, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, this is why we study reasoning. This is why we study rhetoric. So that when we seek to influence someone or lead someone to do something good, we can think about how it should be done so that it is done according to nature. And we're not actually fighting against nature and causing our own trouble, like the cold wind trying to blow a jacket off a traveler. That makes no sense. And so trying to force by strictness a human born with free will makes no sense. When a person is strict with someone else, they make that person grab a hold of their cloak, as it were, and hold it more tightly. That's the natural reaction because of our freedom. And so you can see that there are many, many different applications of this fable. Another is sometimes people get plans for their life and they think, oh, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this, and they don't think about nature. Some people say, I'm going to grow oranges, and they live in a place with cold weather and they don't think about nature. So it's important for us to be wise and to make decisions, always thinking about the nature of things. And that, I think, is the moral lesson of the fable of the wind and the sun. If we act contrary to nature, even though we're powerful like the north wind, we will work in vain. And if we work according to nature, as the sun did, our work will be very easy, because we have nature helping us, nature collaborating with us and working with us on our side. And so that, I believe, is the moral lesson of the wind and the sun. And I've provided a couple of of applications. And what I'd like you to do, and this is the challenge for you in this lesson. I've already explained what I think is the moral of this fable. I've already given some examples. I've given you one specific example from my life. I'd like you to think of a specific example in your life. It could be something you've already done, or it could be something you might do in the future. But I want you to think of a specific example of how this fable, how the moral lesson of this fable can apply to your individual life. I don't want you to give me the moral or just restate the moral. I want you to give me a specific example of where this moral lesson has been seen in your life or could be used in your life. That's what I would like to see when you complete the assignment to discuss the application of this fable. So think carefully. I'm sure you can find examples of this moral lesson, and I'd like to challenge you to do that. That's what makes your response on the assessment really interesting. It's really interesting to see how the morals of these fables find application in your unique life. That's what's really interesting. So try and do that when you complete the assessment. That's going to be all for this fable on the wind. And again, we should make it clear, the north wind and the sun. I hope that's a helpful guide for you as you study this fable. If you have any questions about it or would like to suggest anything else, that's fine. For example, if you say, you know what, I see a different moral lesson in this fable, good, explain it. Just make sure you pay attention to all the details. Because if you present a different moral lesson, but you show that it makes sense with all the details of the fable, that'll be great. But if you share a moral lesson, a different moral lesson, and it doesn't really go along with all the details, that will get marked wrong. So just be careful that you consider all the details of the fable. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.